Surveillance cameras at Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center captured a red sedan passing through the main gate heading east. The driver was alone, a Marine corporal finishing an overnight shift. 12 minutes later at 7:14 a.m., a blue Toyota Corolla followed, leaving the base and turning toward the open desert. Behind the wheel was a 19-year-old Marine wife, wearing a pink shirt and carrying a small backpack. Her name was Erin Corwin. Erin was newly pregnant, and only one man knew the truth about that pregnancy. Her next-door neighbor, her secret lover, and the person she trusted more than anyone else in the world. She was on her way to meet him, unaware that in less than 6 hours she would be dead. Erin Lee Corwin grew up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, adopted as an infant by loving parents who raised her in the shadow of the Smoky Mountains. She was quiet, artistic, a girl who preferred sketching horses to crowded parties. At 17, she met Jonathan Corwin at church, a young Marine stationed at nearby Oak Ridge. He was 20, earnest, and completely smitten. They married in 2012, a simple ceremony in her hometown church. When Jonathan received orders to Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center 29 Palms in September 2013, Erin followed him to California, leaving behind everything familiar for the vast, unforgiving desert of San Bernardino County. 29 Palms is a military town built on sand and survival. Temperatures soar past 115 degrees in summer. The landscape is lunar jagged rock formations, creosote bushes, and hundreds of abandoned mining shafts from the gold rush era. Marines trained there for deployment. Wives, many of them barely out of their teens, waited in identical base housing units arranged in neat rows. Erin moved into a 2-bedroom ranch house on Jasmine Street in the 29 Palms housing complex. The house next door was occupied by Christopher Brandon Lee, a 24-year-old Marine corporal, and his wife, Nicole. Christopher Lee was everything Jonathan Corwin was not. Tall, confident, with a sharp jawline and an easy swagger. He'd served in Afghanistan. He carried himself like someone who'd seen things, survived things. Nicole, his wife, was pregnant with their second child. To casual observers, the Lees and the Corwins were two young military families living ordinary lives, sharing backyard barbecues and idle conversation about deployment schedules. But proximity breeds opportunity. In February 2014, Erin began spending more time at the Lee household. Christopher worked irregular hours. Nicole was often preoccupied with their toddler daughter. The affair began slowly, a conversation that lasted too long, a glance that lingered, then came the touches, the excuses to be alone. "Your husband doesn't see you the way I do," Christopher told her one afternoon in early March, his hand resting on her lower back as they stood in his garage. Erin looked away. "This is wrong," she whispered. "Then why does it feel right?" By April, they were meeting regularly when Jonathan worked night shifts. Erin would slip through the shared backyard gate after dark, crossing the 15 feet between houses like crossing into another world. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she could stop. Christopher understood how to manipulate vulnerability. He'd learned in Afghanistan that control came from knowing what people wanted most and withholding it just enough to keep them desperate. With Erin, it was simple. She wanted to feel seen, chosen, special. He gave her just enough attention to keep her coming back, always holding himself slightly out of reach. "Does John make you feel this way?" Christopher asked one night in late March, his hand tracing patterns on her shoulder as they lay on the couch in his darkened living room. Nicole was asleep upstairs with their daughter. "No," Erin whispered, guilt and desire warring in her chest. "Never like this. Because he doesn't really know you. He sees what he wants to see." Erin wanted to protest, to defend her husband, but the words felt hollow. Jonathan was good, dependable, safe, but Christopher made her feel alive in ways that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Then she discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy changed everything. Erin believed the child was Christopher's. She'd done the math, the timing aligned with when they'd been most reckless, when protection had been forgotten in moments of passion. She texted her best friend Jessica Trentham on April 19th. "I think I'm pregnant. John thinks it's his. I don't know what to do." When Erin's pregnancy became known in mid-April, Jonathan was overjoyed. He wanted to be a father. He bought baby clothes, researched cribs, talked excitedly about names. Erin smiled and played along, even as dread coiled in her stomach. She confided in Christopher during a stolen moment in his truck, parked near the base commissary. "It's yours," she said, her voice breaking. "I know it is." Christopher's expression darkened. "You can't know that." "I do. Erin, you need to handle this." His coldness stunned her. This wasn't the passionate lover who whispered promises in the dark. This was a stranger calculating consequences. But Erin held on to hope. She believed love would prevail. She believed Christopher would leave Nicole, that they'd build a life together. She texted him constantly, messages filled with hearts and plans for their future. Christopher responded, but his replies grew shorter, more distant. Then the affair was exposed. Nicole Lee discovered text messages on Christopher's phone in late April. The confrontation was volcanic. Nicole called Erin a homewrecker. Jonathan discovered the truth shortly after, when Nicole showed up at his door demanding he control his wife. The betrayal shattered him. There were shouting matches in the Corwin household that neighbors heard through thin walls. Erin cried for days. Jonathan considered divorce. But in early May, an uneasy truce formed. Erin promised to end contact with Christopher. Jonathan, devastated but still in love, agreed to try counseling. The two couples agreed to avoid each other completely. On the surface, it appeared over. Except Christopher Lee and Erin Corwin were still seeing each other in secret. They met in parking lots, in remote spots near the base perimeter. Erin believed Christopher still loved her. She interpreted his willingness to continue the affair as proof he couldn't let her go. What she didn't know was that Christopher Lee had already decided she was a problem that needed to be permanently solved. Starting June 21st, Christopher Lee began making preparations. He drove to the Rose of Peru mining district 20 miles southeast of 29 Palms, a desolate area riddled with abandoned gold mine shafts from the 1800s. He scouted locations, peering down vertical shafts that plunged hundreds of feet into darkness. He selected one in particular, Mine Shaft 108, its opening partially concealed by desert brush. The shaft was perfect, remote enough that no hikers or prospectors would stumble across it, deep enough that a body at the bottom would be invisible from the surface, narrow enough at the opening that the fall would be uninterrupted, no ledges to catch on, no horizontal tunnels to divert the trajectory. Christopher stood at the edge and imagined Erin's body falling through darkness. The thought didn't disturb him. It felt like solving a logistics problem. On June 22nd, he returned to the mine with measuring tools. He dropped rocks, listening for the impact to gauge depth. The echo suggested over 100 feet, possibly more. Satisfied, he drove back to base and began researching methods of body disposal on his laptop. Search history recovered later showed queries for how deep does a body need to be buried, and can bodies decompose in desert heat? Christopher also researched explosives. He wanted to create an event that would collapse the mine shaft or incinerate Erin's remains completely. Propane tanks, he learned, could produce significant explosions if ruptured in confined spaces. He purchased a 20-pound tank from a local hardware store, telling the clerk he needed it for a camping trip. He also consulted with fellow Marines in casual conversation. One Marine later testified that Christopher asked him hypothetically about hiding bodies in the desert. "I told him mine shafts would work," the Marine said. "I thought he was joking around." Christopher wasn't joking. He was planning murder with chilling precision. In his garage, Christopher constructed a garrote, a crude but effective killing tool made from rebar handles and steel wire. The wire was 48 inches long, looped through the hollow handles. When pulled tight from behind, it would compress the victim's throat, cutting off air. Death would take minutes. Christopher tested the garrote's tension in his garage, wrapping the wire around a post and pulling until it bit deep into the wood. On June 27th, Christopher texted Erin, "Let's do something special tomorrow. Just us. I want to celebrate." Erin's heart soared. She texted back immediately. "Really?" "A surprise. A beautiful spot I found in the desert. I'll pick you up at 7. That night, Erin laid out her outfit, a pink shirt, comfortable jeans. She packed a small backpack with water, sunscreen, and her journal. She believed Christopher was finally ready to commit, perhaps even to tell Nicole he was leaving. She imagined them together, raising their child under California sunshine. She had no idea she was packing for her own execution. June 28th, 2014 dawned clear and hot. Jonathan had left for duty at 6:30 a.m. At 7:14 a.m., Erin Corwin drove her blue Toyota Corolla through the base gate, telling the guard she was going sightseeing. Surveillance footage showed her smiling. She looked happy. Christopher Lee followed in his red sedan 30 minutes later, maintaining distance to avoid suspicion. He'd placed the garrote in the trunk, along with a propane tank, an accelerant he planned to use to obliterate Erin's remains in a mineshaft explosion. They met at a prearranged spot near the Rose of Peru district. Erin parked her Corolla and climbed into Christopher's vehicle, bubbling with excitement. "Where are we going?" "You'll see. Trust me." He drove deeper into the desert, following dirt roads that hadn't seen traffic in months. The terrain grew more jagged, more hostile. When Erin began to ask questions, Christopher reassured her with smiles and vague promises. "Almost there. You're going to love this." At approximately 9:15 a.m., Christopher stopped the sedan near Mineshaft 108. He told Erin they needed to walk the rest of the way. She followed, trusting him completely, even as the desert heat climbed past 100 degrees. They reached the mineshaft, opening a dark circle in the earth surrounded by creosote bushes. Erin stopped at the edge, peering down uncertainly. "What is this?" "Look closer," Christopher said, stepping behind her. In that instant, Christopher Lee pulled the garrote from his waistband and looped it around Erin Corwin's neck. She gasped, hands flying to her throat, but Christopher pulled the wire tight, wrenching her backward. Erin fought desperately, clawing at the wire, kicking against the ground. Her fingers tore at the steel, drawing blood from her own palms. She tried to scream but could only manage choked gasps. Christopher braced his knee against her spine for leverage, pulling the handles in opposite directions. The wire bit deep into Erin's throat, crushing her windpipe, severing blood flow to her brain. She bucked violently, driven by the most primal human instinct, the need to breathe. "Please," she choked out, barely audible. Christopher pulled harder. He felt her pulse hammering against the wire, frantic and weakening. Felt her body's desperate convulsions transitioning to weaker spasms. Felt the exact moment her strength began to fail. Erin's struggles weakened. Her vision blurred. Her lungs burned. The desert sky above her faded from brilliant blue to gray to black. The last thing she saw was the man she loved, his face expressionless, methodically ending her life. After approximately 5 minutes of sustained strangulation, Erin Corwin went limp. Christopher held the garrote tight for another 30 seconds, ensuring she was dead. Then he released her body. It crumpled onto the hard desert earth. Christopher Lee stood over the woman who had trusted him, loved him, carried what she believed was his child. He felt nothing. This was a problem solved, a threat eliminated. He dragged Erin's body to the mineshaft opening and shoved it over the edge. Her body fell silently through darkness, tumbling 140 feet before striking the bottom with a sickening impact. Christopher tossed the propane tank down after her, intending to create an explosion that would collapse the shaft or incinerate her remains. But the tank failed to ignite on impact. Frustrated but unwilling to descend to check, Christopher covered the shaft opening with brush and drove away. At 11:43 a.m., Christopher Lee returned to the base, calm and collected. Erin Corwin's blue Toyota remained parked in the desert, waiting for a driver who would never return. When Erin didn't come home that night, Jonathan Corwin initially assumed she'd gone shopping or was avoiding him after another argument. But by midnight, concern turned to panic. He called her cell phone repeatedly. It went straight to voicemail. He drove to nearby shopping centers, searching parking lots. Nothing. At 2 a.m. on June 29th, Jonathan Corwin called the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department to report his wife missing. Deputy Isabel Megley took the call, noting that Erin was 4 months pregnant and had left no note. The investigation began immediately. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed friends and neighbors. Lead Detective Jonathan Woods recognized the patterns immediately. Young military wife, troubled marriage, possible affair. Statistically, in cases where a pregnant woman disappeared, the perpetrator was almost always someone close to the victim. Woods pulled the couple's phone records within 12 hours. What he found confirmed his instincts. Hundreds of text messages between Erin Corwin and Christopher Lee, continuing right up until the day before her disappearance. The content was damning references to our baby, plans to be together, and Christopher's increasingly cold responses. Nicole Lee was questioned and made a statement that struck investigators as odd. No body, no case. It was a strange thing for a neighbor to say about a missing pregnant woman. Detective Woods made a note in his case file. Subject NL appears to have prior knowledge. Recommend surveillance. Christopher Lee was interviewed twice in the first 72 hours. He claimed he'd been home all day on June 28th. Nicole provided an alibi, stating Christopher had been with her. But surveillance footage from the base gate told a different story. Christopher's red sedan had left the base at 7:46 a.m. and returned at 11:43 a.m., a 4-hour window that directly contradicted his statement. When confronted, Christopher changed his story. He admitted he'd gone for a drive in the desert, but claimed it was unrelated to Erin's disappearance. Detective Woods sat across from Christopher in the interrogation room, studying the young Marine's body language. "Where exactly did you drive?" Woods asked. "Just out past the base. Nowhere specific. For 4 hours? I needed to think. Clear my head." "About what?" Christopher hesitated. "The affair. The pregnancy. All of it." Woods leaned forward. "No. You're certain?" "I'm certain." The lie detector test administered 3 days later told a different story. Christopher Lee showed significant deception on every question related to Erin's disappearance. But polygraph results weren't admissible in court, and without a body or clear evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. The search for Erin Corwin became one of the most intensive missing person efforts in San Bernardino County history. Volunteers, Marines, law enforcement, and search and rescue teams combed 300 square miles of Mojave Desert. The challenge was staggering. The region contained over 100 abandoned mine shafts, many unmapped and hidden beneath decades of desert growth. Temperatures during the search exceeded 115 degrees. Volunteers descended into mine shafts on ropes, shining flashlights into abyssal darkness. They found rattlesnakes, rusted equipment, animal carcasses, but no Erin. Each mine shaft presented unique dangers. Some had unstable walls that crumbled at the slightest touch. Others were flooded with standing water that reeked of sulfur and decay. The vertical shafts were the most treacherous, straight drops of 50 to 200 feet into pitch darkness. Rescue specialists had to be lowered on rope systems, never knowing what awaited at the bottom. By early August, morale was declining. They'd checked 78 shafts. The desert had swallowed volunteers' hope along with Erin. Some openly questioned whether she'd ever be found. Desert predators, coyotes, vultures could scatter remains across miles. Heat and time could reduce a body to bone fragments indistinguishable from the desert floor. But Detective Woods refused to quit. He studied maps of the Rose of Peru district obsessively, marking each checked shaft, calculating probability zones based on cell tower pings and Christopher Lee's known movements. One cluster of mines kept drawing his attention. A remote area accessible only by rough dirt roads. Exactly the kind of place someone might choose if they wanted absolute isolation. Days turned into weeks. Jonathan Corwin gave tearful press conferences, pleading for information. Erin's mother arrived from Tennessee, devastated. The story attracted national media attention. A pregnant Marine wife vanished without a trace. On July 7th, 2014, detectives executed a search warrant on Christopher Lee's residence. They seized his laptop, cell phone, and vehicle. Forensic analysis revealed damning evidence. Internet searches for body disposal, text messages between Christopher and Erin showing their secret affair had continued after the supposed breakup, and cell tower data that placed Christopher's phone in the Rose of Peru mining district on the morning of June 28th, exactly where Erin's phone had last pinged before going dark. In Christopher's garage, investigators found wire and rebar materials consistent with garrote construction. But the garrote itself was missing. Christopher had already disposed of the primary murder weapon. On August 6, 2014, Christopher and Nicole Lee abruptly packed their belongings and drove to Alaska, where Christopher had family. Detectives learned of the departure within hours and notified Alaska state troopers. Meanwhile, the desert search continued. Detective Jonathan Woods coordinated efforts with mine rescue specialists. They'd already checked 78 mine shafts with no success. On August 15th, a search team reached mine shaft 108 inches, a remote area 20 miles southeast of 29 Palms. The shaft opening was partially concealed by brush, exactly the kind of location a suspect might choose. A volunteer cave rescue specialist named Doug Billings volunteered to descend. At 10:30 a.m. on August 16th, Doug Billings was lowered 140 feet into the darkness. He carried a GoPro camera attached to his helmet. At the bottom, His headlamp beam swept across the shaft floor. There, partially obscured by rocks and debris, was a human body. Female. Decomposed but recognizable. She wore a pink shirt. "I've got her," Doug said into his radio, his voice hollow with the weight of discovery. "I've got Erin." The recovery operation took 14 hours. Erin Corwin's remains were carefully extracted from the mine shaft on August 17th. The medical examiner confirmed her identity through dental records. Cause of death: ligature strangulation. A garrote wire was still embedded in the decomposed tissue of her neck. Fragments of the wire matched the type Christopher Lee had purchased at a hardware store 2 weeks before the murder. Near Erin's body, investigators found a Sprite bottle. DNA analysis later revealed it contained genetic material from both Erin Corwin and Christopher Lee, physical proof they'd been together at the mine. On August 17th, 2014, at 10 p.m. Alaska time, Alaska State Troopers pulled over Christopher Brandon Lee during a traffic stop in Anchorage. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances. Christopher Lee was extradited to California. He pleaded not guilty. Nicole Lee was designated a person of interest, but never charged. Her statement, "no body, no case," haunted the investigation, suggesting she may have known more than she admitted. The trial began in October 2016 in San Bernardino County Superior Court. Prosecutor Sean Doherty presented a methodical case. The affair, the pregnancy, the premeditation, the mineshaft scouting trips, the internet searches, the cell tower data, the DNA evidence. The prosecution called 23 witnesses over 3 weeks. Jessica Trentham, Erin's best friend, testified about the text messages revealing the affair and Erin's belief that Christopher was the baby's father. She broke down on the stand when shown messages from Erin expressing hope that Christopher would leave Nicole. She loved him, Jessica said, tears streaming. She really believed he loved her back. FBI agent Kevin Bowles testified about cell tower analysis. On June 28, 2014, both Christopher Lee's and Erin Corwin's cell phones had pinged off the same remote tower in the Rose of Peru district between 9 and 11 a.m. Christopher's phone then moved back toward the base. Erin's phone never moved again. Forensic experts testified about the garrote wire found embedded in Erin's neck tissue. The wire matched samples of material purchased by Christopher Lee at a local hardware store on June 15th, 2 weeks before the murder. Metal shavings found in Christopher's garage matched the composition of the garrote's rebar handles. The most damning testimony came from fellow Marines, who described conversations with Christopher about hiding bodies in the desert. Corporal Brian Bass testified that Christopher had asked him, seemingly casually, about the best methods to dispose of remains in remote locations. He said mine shafts were perfect because nobody checks them, Bass testified. I thought he was joking around. It didn't occur to me that he was planning something real. Christopher Lee's defense attorney, David Kaloyanides, argued that the prosecution's case was circumstantial. Yes, Christopher had an affair with Erin. Yes, he'd been in the desert on June 28th, but that didn't prove murder. Perhaps Erin had committed suicide. Perhaps she'd fallen into the mine shaft accidentally while following Christopher on their desert excursion. The prosecution demolished these theories. Suicide victims don't strangle themselves with garrotes. Accidental falls don't result in homemade garrotes being wrapped around throats. And Christopher's internet searches for body disposal methods proved intent, not accident. On November 2nd, 2016, Christopher Lee took the stand in his own defense. What he said stunned the courtroom. He confessed to killing Erin Corwin, but claimed it was justified. He alleged that Erin had molested his daughter, and the murder was revenge. Prosecutors immediately challenged this claim as fabricated a desperate attempt to introduce a motive that might generate sympathy. No evidence supported the molestation allegation. Law enforcement had investigated the claim and found it baseless. To demonstrate the murder, Christopher Lee asked for props. A doll and a garrote were provided. In front of a silent courtroom, Christopher wrapped the garrote around the doll's neck and pulled. He held it tight for 5 full minutes, the approximate time it took to strangle Erin Corwin to death. Jurors watched in horror. Some wept. One later said, "He showed no emotion. He demonstrated killing her like he was explaining how to change a tire." On November 3rd, 2016, after deliberating for just 2 hours, the jury returned a verdict. guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of lying in wait. The special circumstance meant Christopher Lee was eligible for life in prison without the possibility of parole. During sentencing on November 29, 2016, Judge J. David Mazurek addressed Christopher Lee directly. "You planned this murder meticulously. You lured a pregnant woman who loved you into the desert and strangled her to death. You threw her body down a mine shaft and left her family to suffer for 49 days. You have shown no remorse." Christopher Brandon Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at California Institution for Men in Chino, California. Jonathan Corwin has never remarried. He left the Marine Corps and returned to Tennessee, where he lives quietly, far from the desert that swallowed his wife and unborn child. Erin Corwin's body was returned to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where she was buried in a small cemetery overlooking the Smoky Mountains, the landscape of her childhood, far from the brutal desert where her life ended. The case remains a stark reminder of how trust can become a weapon in the hands of someone willing to kill. Erin believed in love, even when love had turned cold. She believed Christopher Lee when he promised her something beautiful in the desert. Instead, he gave her death in darkness, 140 feet below the earth. And in the end, the evidence spoke louder than any lie Christopher Lee could tell. The mine shaft kept Erin's body, but it also kept the truth.